There is a kind of evil that wears a uniform, holds a weapon, and marches in formation. We recognize it easily. We see its destruction. We name it, and we rally against it. But then there is another kind, more subtle, more disarming. It smiles in ignorance, defends nonsense with confidence, and in its wake leaves confusion, fear, and silence. This kind of evil, Dietrich Bonhoeffer warned, is not born out of malice, but out of stupidity. Stupidity. It is a word we throw around casually. We use it as an insult, a punchline, or a defense when things go wrong. But Bonhoeffer, a German pastor and philosopher who stood against the Nazi regime, believed it was much more than that. To him, stupidity was not just a lack of intelligence. It was a dangerous social and psychological phenomenon, one that spreads faster than reason, one that empowers tyranny more efficiently than violence. Why is this relevant today? Because we are surrounded by voices, some loud, some disguised as ordinary, who insist that critical thought is unnecessary, that convenience matters more than truth, that being certain is more important than being right. And often, these voices are not driven by hatred or cruelty. They are driven by thoughtlessness, by collective pressure, by the ease of not questioning. That, Bonhoeffer said, is what makes stupidity more dangerous than evil itself. It resists correction, it cannot be argued with, and it becomes a weapon in the hands of power. This video is not an attack. It is an invitation to look closely, to understand what Bonhoeffer saw from the depths of a prison cell in Nazi Germany, to trace the psychological roots of stupidity, not as a personal failing, but as a societal illness, and to ask ourselves, in an age of noise, distraction, and blind repetition, how do we stay awake? We will explore the historical moment in which Bonhoeffer wrote these words, understanding the courage it took to name such a quiet force while surrounded by very loud ones. We will dig into how psychologists today explain collective blindness, the flight from reason, and the rise of performative thinking. And we will reflect on the emotional cost, not just for society, but for each of us individually, when we stop thinking, when we surrender our judgment, when we become bystanders in our own lives. This is a story of resistance, not just against regimes, but against the numbness that allows them to rise. It is a story about reclaiming the mind, the self, and our capacity to think with clarity in a world that often rewards the opposite. Bonhoeffer did not survive the world he tried to awaken, but his insights did. And perhaps now, more than ever, we need to listen, not just with our ears, but with the full presence of our own inner awareness. Let us begin. To understand Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity, we have to begin not with the word itself, but with the time in which it was spoken. The year was 1943. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a theologian, pastor, and member of the German resistance, had been arrested by the Gestapo. He was imprisoned at Tegel military prison in Berlin. From his small, dark cell, he reflected on how the German people, once capable of producing some of the greatest philosophers, artists, and scientists in history, had fallen into such moral and intellectual ruin. It is easy to assume that evil comes only from the corrupt or the cruel. But Bonhoeffer had seen something far more disturbing. He observed that some of the worst atrocities were enabled not by hatred or bloodlust, but by people who appeared ordinary, polite, even well-meaning. People who, when asked to explain why they supported the regime, repeated empty phrases, who followed rules without thinking, who obeyed because it was easier than understanding. He realized something chilling. Evil doesn't always need monsters. Sometimes it only needs a majority of people to stop thinking for themselves. In his now famous letters from prison, Bonhoeffer wrote, "Stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of the good than malice." This was not a casual insult. It was a carefully considered diagnosis. Bonhoeffer wasn't calling people dumb. He was describing a psychological condition, one that overtakes individuals when they are absorbed into a group or system that discourages critical thought. In this state, people no longer act as individuals. They surrender their judgment to the crowd, and once they do, they become impervious to reason. He observed that stupidity is not an intellectual defect. It has nothing to do with IQ, education, or academic ability. In fact, some of the most educated people in Germany became tools of the Nazi machine. Stupidity, for Bonhoeffer, was moral blindness, the inability or unwillingness to think independently, especially when it is most needed. This diagnosis wasn't new, though Bonhoeffer's language gave it piercing clarity. Throughout history, thinkers have warned against this collective abandonment of thought. Plato, in his allegory of the cave, described people chained in darkness, mistaking shadows on the wall for reality. The moment someone breaks free and sees the light, they are ridiculed or attacked. Why? Because questioning the illusion threatens the comfort of the group. Centuries later, during the Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant defined enlightenment as the human being, as emergence from self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity being the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. He added, "Have courage to use your own understanding." The warning was clear, even then. The greatest danger to truth is not always the lie, it is the silence, the apathy, the reflex to conform. We see this play out again and again. In Maoist China, during the Cultural Revolution, students turned on their teachers, families turned on each other, not because they were inherently cruel, but because the machinery of ideology rewarded mindless obedience. In Rwanda, radio broadcasts fueled genocide, not by forcing people to kill, but by slowly numbing them to thought, to conscience, to moral responsibility. In each case, mass stupidity did not look like madness. It looked like normalcy. Bonhoeffer's insight that stupidity is socially induced explains why otherwise intelligent people can become dangerously irrational in the right environment. He believed that when individuals are isolated, they can think, they can doubt. But once they are swept into a movement, a crowd, a cause, the thinking part of them is suspended. They no longer ask what is true or good. They only ask what is permitted, what is expected, what is safe. In this sense, stupidity becomes a form of protection. It shields people from the discomfort of doubt. It allows them to move with the tide, to fit in, to avoid the risk of standing alone. And that is why, in authoritarian systems, stupidity is cultivated. It is not an accident, it is a feature. Propaganda, censorship, and repetition are not meant to inform. They are meant to disable the individual mind. But Bonhoeffer didn't place the blame solely on those who fell into this trap. He recognized that in systems where power is centralized, where fear and surveillance dominate, independent thought becomes dangerous. He wrote, "In conversation with him, one virtually feels that one is dealing not at all with a person, but with slogans, catchwords, and the like that have taken possession of him." This, to him, was the true horror. When a person gives up their self, their conscience, their ability to reflect, they become a mouthpiece for forces they no longer understand. Yet he also believed this condition was reversible. He said that stupidity can be defeated not through instruction, but through liberation. A person does not become free by learning new facts. They become free when they reclaim their ability to think, to feel, to ask. It is easy to judge the past and feel superior. But what Bonhoeffer revealed was not about a particular moment in German history. It was about human nature, the impulse to conform, the fear of exclusion, the desire to belong. They are universal. And in times of crisis, when uncertainty runs high, we are most vulnerable to surrendering our mind for the illusion of clarity. In today's world, stupidity has taken on new forms. It hides in algorithms that reward outrage over thought. It spreads through social media in the form of performative opinions. It flourishes in echo chambers, where complexity is replaced with slogans, where curiosity is mocked as weakness. The technology has changed, but the dynamic remains the same. What Bonhoeffer described is not a relic of the 20th century. It is the backdrop of the 21st. Understanding the historical roots of Bonhoeffer's warning helps us realize that stupidity is not a matter of intelligence or education. It is a moral and psychological condition, one that can be triggered by fear, by power, by isolation, or by convenience. And if we are not aware, we can become part of it without ever realizing. As we move forward, we will explore how modern psychology has come to describe this same phenomenon in its own language: groupthink, cognitive dissonance, motivated reasoning. But Bonhoeffer's gift was to name the danger not in clinical terms, but in human ones. He gave us a mirror, and he asked us, gently but firmly, "Are you thinking your own thoughts, or are you letting someone else do it for you?" That is the question we must keep asking, not just of others, but of ourselves. Modern psychology, in its effort to understand the human mind, has arrived at many of the same conclusions Bonhoeffer reached from his prison cell. The language is different. The framework is empirical rather than philosophical. But the concern remains. What happens to the individual when thought is abandoned in favor of belonging, when complexity is replaced with slogans, and when the inner voice is drowned out by the roar of the crowd? Let us begin with the concept of groupthink, a term coined by psychologist Irving Janis in the 1970s. Groupthink occurs when a group of people, seeking harmony or consensus, begin to suppress dissenting opinions. Critical thinking is replaced with agreement. People self-censor. They ignore red flags. And before long, the group acts not as a collection of individuals, but as a single, unthinking entity. History is full of examples: policy blunders, corporate scandals, and, yes, political atrocities. In groupthink, the smartest people can make the most foolish decisions. This aligns closely with what Bonhoeffer described. The danger, he said, is not that individuals lack intelligence, but that they stop using it once absorbed into a collective. They lose their moral autonomy. And the frightening part is, they often feel safer this way. Social psychologist Solomon Asch's conformity experiments in the 1950s revealed something similarly unsettling. Participants were asked to compare line lengths. The task was simple. But when surrounded by Confederates who deliberately gave the wrong answer, many participants conformed, despite knowing the truth. They ignored their own perception in order to fit in. This shows how easily thought can be compromised by social pressure. We do not conform because we are stupid. We conform because we fear isolation. We fear rejection. And eventually, we may even come to believe the illusion. Another layer to this is cognitive dissonance, a theory introduced by Leon Festinger. It describes the psychological discomfort we feel when we hold two conflicting beliefs or when our behavior contradicts our values. To reduce this discomfort, we often change our beliefs to match our actions, even if those actions were wrong. For example, someone who supports a harmful policy might justify it later by saying it was necessary or patriotic, not because they were convinced by evidence, but because admitting error is too painful. It threatens the ego, and so irrationality becomes self-defense. Bonhoeffer would have seen this not just as a psychological mechanism, but as a moral danger. When people abandon reason to preserve self-image or group loyalty, they lose the ability to take responsibility. They become hollow, echoing ideas that are not their own. He described these people as no longer persons, but instruments, functioning without reflection. In Jungian terms, we might say they have been swallowed by the collective shadow. Carl Jung believed that every society has a shadow, the parts of itself it represses or denies. When individuals fail to confront their personal shadow, they become more susceptible to the collective one. They project their own fears and flaws onto others, and they participate, often unconsciously, in systems of oppression, scapegoating, or violence. The more unconscious a person is, the more dangerous they can become when caught in a collective storm. We see this in mythology too. In the ancient Greek story of the Bacchae, a group of women, under the influence of Dionysus, abandon their rational selves and descend into frenzy. They commit acts they would never consider in solitude, but under the influence of the group, of the god, of the mood, they lose themselves, and when the spell is broken, they are horrified. They see what they have done, but it is too late. This is not just ancient mythology, it is modern psychology. In certain conditions, people become entranced. They fall into what psychologists call de-individuation, a state where identity is submerged in the group. Anonymity, emotional arousal, and diffusion of responsibility all contribute. In riots, cults, and mobs, people often act without awareness. They feel powerful, righteous, immune. But once alone again, they wonder, what was I thinking? Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity points directly at this loss of self. When people stop thinking critically, they don't just make poor decisions. They become disconnected from their own conscience. They may laugh at cruelty, excuse corruption, or cheer for violence, because their inner compass has gone silent. This is why he saw stupidity as more dangerous than evil. Evil still knows what it is. Stupidity does not. It cannot recognize itself. Nowhere is this more visible than in the modern attention economy. We live in a time where information is endless, yet understanding is rare. Social media amplifies emotional reactions, anger, outrage, moral certainty. These platforms reward the most confident voices, not the most thoughtful ones. Algorithms promote content that confirms our biases. And in this environment, thoughtful silence becomes invisible. Complexity becomes boring, and stupidity, disguised as conviction, goes viral. What makes this particularly dangerous is that the illusion of knowledge has replaced knowledge itself. People feel informed because they've read a headline. They feel certain because others agree. But they have not paused. They have not asked. And, most of all, they have not listened. This is where motivated reasoning comes in. We do not always seek truth. We seek confirmation. Once a belief is adopted, whether political, religious, or social, our brains begin to filter information to protect that belief. We ignore what contradicts it. We embrace what supports it. And so, even when confronted with facts, people often double down. Not because they are stupid, but because their identity is attached to the belief. Bonhoeffer understood this deeply. He saw how dangerous it was to tie identity to ideology, to confuse agreement with virtue. When people believe their group is always right, they stop thinking altogether. And once they stop thinking, they become dangerous, not because they hate, but because they obey. So where does that leave us? Are we doomed to be pulled into stupidity, again and again? Not necessarily. Psychology also offers hope. Studies show that self-reflection, intellectual humility, and emotional regulation can protect against these traps. When people are encouraged to sit with discomfort, to entertain opposing views, to pause before reacting, they become less vulnerable to manipulation. They begin to think for themselves. But it takes courage, because thinking is not easy. It is not glamorous. It often means standing alone. And in a world that celebrates speed, certainty, and spectacle, slowing down to reflect can feel like rebellion. Bonhoeffer believed this rebellion was sacred. He called for a deeper kind of courage, not just the bravery to fight external enemies, but the quiet strength to remain inwardly free, to keep the mind awake, to protect it from capture, to ask, again and again, is this really true? Is this really good? Is this really mine? In the next section, we will explore what happens when this kind of awareness is lost, how stupidity impacts our relationships, our society, and even our sense of self. Because the consequences are not abstract. They live in our homes, our workplaces, our communities, and they shape the world we inherit. But for now, ask yourself, where in your life are you thinking automatically? Where have you accepted someone else's truth without testing it? And, most importantly, are your thoughts truly yours? Let that question echo for a while. When we speak about the danger of stupidity as Bonhoeffer described it, it can feel abstract, philosophical, distant, something that exists in history books or political tragedies. But the real tragedy is that it does not stay there. The consequences of collective unthinking are not only societal, they are deeply personal. They seep into our relationships, our careers, our communities, and even our identities. The moment we stop thinking for ourselves, we begin living someone else's life. In personal relationships, this shows up in subtle but painful ways. Think of the partner who repeats what culture says about love but never questions how they themselves show up in it. Or the friend who adopts every popular opinion but has never reflected on their own values. When we let social approval replace self-awareness, we lose authenticity. We perform roles instead of living from the inside out. Stupidity in this sense is not a lack of intelligence. It is a lack of presence. It is being disconnected from your own emotions, unable to think clearly because you're too busy reacting, too busy conforming. How many of us have gone through whole phases of life, years even, making decisions not because they were right for us, but because they were expected, easy, or unexamined? Bonhoeffer's warning is not just for dictatorships. It is for moments when a person stops questioning their path, when reflection feels too heavy, or when silence is filled with the voices of others telling you who to be. This is how stupidity impacts identity. It replaces soul-searching with role-playing. In the workplace, this shows up as compliance over courage, a culture where no one questions bad policies because that's how we do things, or where innovation is strangled because it challenges authority. People become gears in a machine, afraid to speak up, afraid to think differently. It is the slow erosion of imagination in favor of productivity. The brain may still be active, but the mind is on autopilot. This has consequences far beyond missed opportunities. It shapes who we become. Over time, people in such environments start to feel small. Not because they are small, but because their inner life has been ignored for too long. They begin to question their value, lose their voice, or worse, convince themselves that thinking deeply is impractical, that intuition is weakness, that emotion is a distraction. But this is a kind of spiritual amputation, and like all wounds left untreated, it becomes infected. Socially, the consequences are even more visible. When public conversations are dominated by tribal thinking, we lose the ability to empathize. We dehumanize those who disagree. We mistake volume for clarity and certainty for wisdom. Social media, politics, even education, these become battlegrounds for identity, not truth. And so we shout slogans instead of asking questions. We defend ideas we haven't thought through. We treat people as symbols instead of souls. This is what Bonhoeffer meant when he said stupidity is more dangerous than malice. The malicious person at least acts with awareness. But the stupid person cannot be reasoned with. Their convictions are borrowed. Their truths are memorized, not earned. This also explains the rise of misinformation. Not just the spread of false facts, but the willingness to believe them. Once the mind has been trained to seek comfort instead of truth, it becomes highly susceptible to manipulation. Advertisers know this. Politicians know this. So do those who weaponize ideology. They do not need to persuade you, they only need to distract you from thinking. Consider the emotional cost. When you cannot trust your own thoughts, you begin to outsource your reality. You second-guess your instincts. You become anxious in silence. You fear being wrong more than you desire being true. This is not freedom. This is dependency disguised as certainty. The consequences ripple even further. Children raised in environments where questioning is discouraged often grow into adults who are either passive or reactive. They may struggle with boundaries, with decision-making, with emotional regulation. They may become hyper-compliant or chronically defiant, not because they lack intelligence, but because they were never taught to think critically while feeling safe. Stupidity, in this form, is inherited. It is passed down not as genetics, but as culture. Bonhoeffer's insights force us to ask, what happens to a society where the majority no longer reflects? Where education becomes memorization and leadership becomes showmanship? Where disagreement is seen as betrayal and doubt is punished instead of explored? We do not need to guess. History has already told us. In totalitarian regimes, the collapse of thought precedes the collapse of freedom. First, people stop asking questions. Then they stop speaking. Then they stop resisting. And eventually, they stop noticing. This is not science fiction. It is the documented psychology of authoritarianism. Hannah Arendt, a political theorist who fled Nazi Germany, described this as the banality of evil. The idea that horrific acts are often carried out not by monsters, but by ordinary people who have forgotten how to think ethically. Bonhoeffer echoed this. He wrote, "Upon closer examination, it becomes apparent that every strong upsurge of power in the public sphere, be it of a political or religious nature, infects a large part of humankind with stupidity. The more power expands, the more thinking contracts. Not by force alone, but by choice, slowly, over time, as people trade self-awareness for safety. But this is not a call to despair. It is a call to return, to re-inhabit our own minds, because for every person who falls asleep to their conscience, there is another who awakens to it. For every system that punishes truth, there are individuals who whisper it anyway. Even in Bonhoeffer's time, under the most brutal conditions, some people kept thinking, kept feeling, kept resisting. They paid dearly for it, but they proved that the human spirit can remain intact, even in captivity. And maybe that is the most important takeaway. Stupidity, as Bonhoeffer defines it, is not inevitable. It is a choice, repeated many times, often unconsciously, until it becomes a habit. But habits can be broken. Awareness can be recovered. The mind can return to itself. That journey begins with small moments, with the willingness to pause before reacting, to ask where an opinion came from, to admit when you do not know, to stay curious, even when it's inconvenient, and perhaps most powerfully, to hold space for silence, for contradiction, for the discomfort that always comes before growth. Because in the end, the cost of not thinking is not just bad decisions. It is the erosion of the self. And the consequence of that erosion is a world where people become interchangeable, where depth is replaced by performance, and where the soul of a society begins to fade. Bonhoeffer saw that risk, and he refused to participate in it, even when it cost him his freedom, even when it cost him his life. In the next section, we will explore how to protect ourselves and each other from falling into this state. We will look at the tools, habits, and practices that can keep the mind awake, not just for the sake of intelligence, but for the sake of integrity, because the goal is not to be clever. The goal is to be whole. To understand stupidity the way Bonhoeffer meant it, we must step beyond the individual. His insight was not just about foolish people. It was about a culture of unthinking, a structure of avoidance, a climate where intelligence, empathy, and truth are gradually replaced by slogans, blind allegiance, and emotional sedation. In other words, stupidity becomes systemic. We often treat intelligence as a personal trait. You're smart or you're not. But Bonhoeffer suggested something far more chilling, that even deeply intelligent people, those with degrees, careers, and high IQs, can fall into stupidity when they surrender their autonomy to the group. It's not about knowledge, it's about consciousness. You can have all the data in the world and still lack clarity. You can memorize facts and still avoid thought. In fact, some of the most dangerous systems in history were led by highly educated people who simply chose not to reflect deeply on what they were doing. So, what causes this? Psychologically, it's rooted in something called diffusion of responsibility, a phenomenon where people become less likely to act ethically or critically when part of a group. The group becomes the authority. And as a result, the individual stops asking, "Should I?" and starts asking, "What do they want me to do?" That's how thinking dies. This is reinforced by social identity theory. We derive part of our sense of self from the groups we belong to: religious, political, professional. But when these groups become rigid, tribal, or absolutist, they demand loyalty over truth. Dissent becomes betrayal. And suddenly, thinking for yourself feels like a threat, not just to the group, but to your very sense of belonging. This is the psychological cradle of Bonhoeffer's Stupidity. It is not ignorance. It is self-abandonment in service of the collective illusion. And the system is more efficient than ever. Algorithms reward outrage, not nuance. Media cycles compress reality into bites too small for actual thought. Political discourse has turned into performance art. You're not expected to listen, only to win. We are flooded with information but starving for wisdom. So what's the result? A world that feels emotionally shallow and intellectually chaotic. We distrust institutions but cling to narratives. We fear being manipulated, but rarely examine how we are already manipulated, by the language we use, the opinions we inherit, the truths we assume. And over time, this cognitive exhaustion becomes emotional numbness. Apathy replaces attention, and in that numbness, stupidity thrives. Not in the form of people lacking intelligence, but in people who no longer use it. Bonhoeffer saw this happening under a fascist regime, but today it manifests in quieter ways. A workplace where no one questions unethical practices. A classroom where disagreement is shamed instead of explored. A family where difficult topics are silenced to keep the peace. A social media echo chamber where complexity is crushed under the weight of certainty. These are the soft terrains where stupidity grows. So how do we resist it? Not just individually, but structurally. It starts with an uncomfortable truth. Systems are made of people who forget they are people. In other words, change is never just top-down. It's bottom-up. It begins when someone somewhere, an employee, a student, a citizen, pauses long enough to ask, "Is this true? Is this right? Does this make sense?" and then dares to act on the answer. This doesn't always mean confrontation. Sometimes it means presence, stillness, choosing not to repost something reactive, choosing to ask a better question in a meeting, choosing to teach your child how to think, not what to think, choosing to admit, humbly, that you don't know. These are not small acts, they are tectonic shifts, because every time one person reclaims their thinking, they give silent permission for others to do the same. And slowly, something changes. Not a revolution, not a spectacle, but a rehumanizing. That's how stupidity is dismantled, not by shaming the stupid, but by reigniting the human. It's important to also acknowledge the emotional layer here. Thinking deeply is not just difficult, it's painful. It requires the courage to admit that you might have been wrong, that you've believed things out of fear, that you followed when you should have paused. This takes immense strength, because reflection can shatter illusions. And illusions are often what keep us emotionally afloat. So we must approach this work with compassion, for ourselves, for others, for those who are still caught in the fog. Bonhoeffer understood this. He wrote from a place of profound love, not superiority. His critiques were not elitist, they were ethical. They were born from a deep ache for humanity to remember itself, to wake up, to return to dignity, even when dignity demands discomfort. This is perhaps the most spiritual dimension of his theory, that thinking, when done honestly, is not just a cognitive act, it is a moral act, a form of soul-keeping, of saying, "I will not give away my attention, I will not be seduced by certainty, I will not sleepwalk through this world. In that way, to think is to love, to feel, to become human again. This idea is echoed across traditions. In Jewish mysticism, the Hebrew word for sin, het, means to miss the mark, not to be evil, but to be out of alignment with your purpose. In Buddhism, ignorance is the root of suffering, not ignorance as lack of knowledge, but as forgetfulness of our true nature. In Christianity, Paul writes, "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind," implying that salvation is as much cognitive as it is spiritual, and in Sufism, thought is seen as a form of remembrance, dhikr, bringing yourself back into presence with what is real and sacred. So this is not just a call to be clever, it is a call to be whole, because when thought is reduced to strategy or survival, we forget who we are, but when thought becomes reflection, when it is tied to meaning and love and truth, we become dangerous in the best possible way. Not loud, not aggressive, but unshakably awake. That is what Bonhoeffer believed was most dangerous to tyranny, not guns or votes or institutions, but the thinking individual. The person who says, "No, I see what is happening. I feel what is missing. I will not comply blindly." The person who cannot be easily owned. So let us return to that, to ourselves, to the sacred, messy, beautiful act of thinking like a human being. In a world that constantly tells us what to think, reclaiming the right to wonder is revolutionary. Let this revolution begin in your own life, and let it spread, not in the form of argument, but in the quiet glow of someone who has remembered their mind, and lives from it, every single day. Bonhoeffer never offered a psychological toolkit. He was not a therapist or neuroscientist. Yet his warning calls for exactly what modern psychology now seeks to cultivate: mental autonomy, emotional awareness, and moral clarity in the face of external pressure. If stupidity, as he defined it, is the abandonment of thinking under social influence, then its antidote must begin within. It must be the daily act of reclaiming your mind. This is no small task. To think deeply in an age of distraction is itself an act of resistance. But it is possible. And more than that, it is necessary. Let us begin with the foundation: self-awareness. In the field of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, there is a core practice called cognitive restructuring. It trains individuals to identify distorted thoughts, examine the evidence, and replace them with more balanced thinking. At first glance, it seems mechanical, but at its heart, it is the modern form of an ancient discipline, the practice of knowing what you are thinking and why. This is the first step out of unconscious stupidity, awareness of your own thought patterns. You do not have to be a scholar. You do not need complex vocabulary. You only need the willingness to pause and observe. Ask yourself, what belief just passed through my mind? Is it true? Where did it come from? Do I live by this belief, or does it live through me? This is not a one-time reflection. It is a way of life. Over time, it becomes a kind of inner hygiene, the mind's version of washing your hands before eating. You clear away the grime of suggestion, propaganda, and fear-based narratives before they become part of your identity. From here, we move to emotional regulation. One of the major reasons people fall into what Bonhoeffer called stupidity is because they are overwhelmed, emotionally hijacked. The limbic system, the brain's emotional center, takes over, and reason collapses under the weight of outrage, fear, or shame. Modern practices like mindfulness meditation are vital here. Mindfulness, in its purest form, is not about serenity. It is about attention. It teaches you to notice your emotional state without being consumed by it. You become the witness, not the reactor. Even a few minutes a day of stillness can rewire the nervous system. It strengthens the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making and reflection. It allows you to respond instead of react. And in a world of instant reaction, response is a superpower. But self-awareness and calm are not enough. Bonhoeffer emphasized the moral dimension, the courage to act, the willingness to stand alone if necessary. This is where integrity becomes central. Philosophical traditions like Stoicism, for instance, offer timeless tools for this kind of internal fortification. Epictetus taught that we must distinguish between what is within our control and what is not. This clarity protects us from panic and allows us to stay rooted in our principles. A practical exercise here is the daily reflection. What did I do today that honored my values? Where did I compromise? Where did I speak truth, and where did I stay silent? Over time, this builds what psychologists now call moral resilience, the ability to stay true to yourself even under pressure. Carl Jung offered another key practice: shadow work. It involves turning inward and exploring the parts of ourselves we ignore, deny, or suppress. This is vital because those who cannot confront their own shadow become highly susceptible to manipulation. They project their darkness onto others, or they absorb the darkness of a group without resistance. Jung wrote that the process of individuation, the becoming of the self, requires the confrontation with what is uncomfortable. It is not enlightenment by light alone, but by bringing light into darkness. This echoes Bonhoeffer's belief that stupidity is not a defect but a condition. And, like any condition, it must be faced, not shamed. One simple practice for shadow work is journaling prompts like, "What do I criticize most in others? Where have I acted in ways I now regret? What am I afraid others would see if they truly knew me?" These questions are not pleasant, but they break the spell. They reconnect you with your humanity. Now, let us look outward, because reclaiming thought is not a solitary mission. It is social. Cultivating relationships that encourage critical thinking is one of the most powerful ways to stay grounded. Seek conversations, not just affirmation. Find people who challenge you with kindness, who invite complexity, who are willing to say, "I disagree, and here's why." This is rare, but when found, it is medicine. And when not found, create it. Be the person who asks questions, who does not rush to certainty, who models reflection in a world of reaction. You do not need to argue loudly to create change. Sometimes the quiet presence of someone who is sincerely thinking is enough to disrupt the sleep of conformity. This is especially important in the digital realm. Digital hygiene is becoming as crucial as mental hygiene. The information we consume shapes our perceptions more than we realize. So ask yourself, what voices do I follow? Do they encourage thought or demand loyalty? Do they deepen my perspective or narrow it? Unfollow accounts that only confirm what you already believe. Limit exposure to outrage media. And curate your digital space like a sacred garden, because your mind grows whatever seeds you plant. Alongside these modern tools, traditional wisdom offers profound guidance. In Sufi teachings, there is a concept called fana, the annihilation of the ego. It does not mean self-erasure. It means letting go of the false self constructed by fear, pride, and illusion. In this state, clarity emerges. The soul remembers what is true. The noise of the world fades, and what remains is presence, intention, and alignment with something greater. In Buddhist practice, the middle way teaches us not to swing between extremes, not to be enslaved by passion or repression, certainty or chaos. Thinking, too, lives in the middle. It is not emotionless, but not overwhelmed, not rigid, but not shapeless. Even in Christian tradition, Bonhoeffer's own faith, there is the invitation to renew the mind, to become transformed not by conforming to the world, but by discerning what is good, acceptable, and whole. It is a call not to blind faith, but to courageous discernment. All of these traditions, old and new, point toward one truth. Thoughtfulness is not a luxury. It is a sacred duty, and reclaiming it in today's world is revolutionary. So let us bring these practices together. daily moments of stillness, journaling that explores both belief and doubt, honest conversations with those who do not echo you, reflection on action and intention, regular digital detoxes, immersion in traditions that emphasize wisdom over noise, and most of all, a commitment to humility. Because the deepest thinkers are not those who know everything, but those who know how much they have yet to understand. Bonhoeffer did not survive to see his words ripple through the modern world, but his insight endures because it names something essential. It does not shame, it awakens. And through it we are reminded, to think is to honor the soul, to resist is to protect the mind, and to remain awake is the beginning of all freedom. In the final section, we will reflect on how this journey, from unthinking to awareness, connects us not only to history, but to each other. Because in the end, reclaiming our minds is not only about intelligence, it is about love, about truth, about being fully human again. What does it mean to be fully human? This question, so ancient and yet so pressing, sits quietly at the heart of Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity. Beneath the philosophical warning, beneath the political implications, what he really pointed to was the loss of something deeply sacred, our capacity to live consciously, to reflect, to discern, to choose who we are, instead of blindly becoming what others expect. In his time, stupidity was not an academic concept. It was a lived reality. It was the collective silence of neighbors who turned their eyes away from injustice. It was the repetition of slogans in place of thought. It was the everyday person, full of potential, who unknowingly became complicit in evil, not because they were evil, but because they had stopped thinking for themselves. That, Bonhoeffer insisted, was the most dangerous form of power. Not brute force, not raw cruelty, but the kind of power that numbs the soul. That convinces you to surrender your conscience, one tiny decision at a time, and if we are honest, we still see this today. We see it in how people are shaped by algorithms more than self-reflection, in how opinions are downloaded rather than developed, in how entire belief systems are absorbed through osmosis, friends, headlines, hashtags, until we mistake noise for truth. But this does not have to be our fate. What Bonhoeffer offered more than anything was a mirror. He did not scorn the stupid person. He asked us to notice the conditions under which stupidity arises. He showed us that it is not a personal failure, but a social illness. And like any illness, it requires compassion, awareness, and treatment. So, if you have ever looked back on your life and thought, why did I believe that? Why didn't I speak up? Why did I follow when I should have asked questions? This is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of awakening. Because to think clearly in a world that often rewards the opposite is a quiet rebellion. It is not flashy. It does not always feel heroic. But it matters. And not just for society, but for you. When you begin to think for yourself, something changes. You begin to live from the inside out. You feel less like a pawn on someone else's board and more like the author of your own path. You stop fearing disagreement. You stop needing constant approval. You find peace not in being certain, but in being sincere. Thinking, real, engaged, ethical thinking, is not a performance. It is a devotion. It's the devotion of the artist who refuses to water down their vision for market trends, the teacher who teaches critical thinking, not memorization, the parent who allows their child to ask difficult questions, the friend who says, let's slow down and actually talk about this, the individual who chooses stillness in a world of reaction. These people, quietly, consistently, are the antidote to the conditions Bonhoeffer warned us about. They are not louder, but they are deeper. They are not more educated, but they are more awake. And the beautiful, often overlooked truth is this: we can become those people, at any moment, at any age, no matter our past. Because thinking is not a talent, It is a return, a remembering of something that was always there, that inner compass, that voice that says, "This doesn't feel right," that whisper that invites us not to be right, but to be real. It is never too late to come home to that voice. So let this be our invitation, not just to criticize the world, but to become more conscious within it. Not just to escape stupidity, but to cultivate wisdom. Not just to avoid manipulation, but to live with intention. Let us reclaim our attention, our curiosity, our discomfort, our nuance. Let us protect thoughtfulness like a sacred fire in a windstorm. Let us speak, even if our voice shakes. Let us think, even when the crowd sleeps. Let us feel, even when the world says it is easier not to. Because Bonhoeffer's words were not merely a diagnosis. They were a call to those who still believe in the dignity of the mind, the courage of the soul, and the possibility of living with depth in an age of distraction. That call now belongs to us. And maybe the most important question we can ask ourselves, today and every day, is simply this: am I thinking, or am I repeating? Because the moment we start asking, the spell begins to break. And in that breaking, something sacred returns. Not certainty, not perfection, but clarity, integrity, the quiet, grounded strength of someone who is no longer asleep. That, in the end, is how stupidity is undone. Not with brilliance, but with presence. Not with rage, but with reflection. Not all at once, but one honest thought at a time. Reclaim your mind. Reclaim your life. If you've made it this far, take a breath. Let it land. Because what we just explored is not just history. It's not just theory. It's your life, your mind, your soul, quietly asking, what am I choosing to become? In a world that moves fast, thinks shallow, and rewards repetition, you made the rare choice to go deep, to question, to reflect, and that matters more than you know. Here on this channel, we're not chasing virality or empty slogans. We're building something slower, richer, more enduring. A space for people like you, who want to understand themselves and the world not just better, but truly. Who are brave enough to think for themselves and tender enough to feel what that thinking reveals. Every video here weaves together the wisdom of psychology, philosophy, and human experience. Because personal growth is not just about hacks and habits, it's about meaning, context, courage. We talk about the quiet traps of modern life, about shame, power, distraction, conformity, love. We ask difficult questions without rushing to easy answers, and we do it together. So if you felt something stir in you today, an ache, a recognition, a sense that you are meant to live with more intention and less noise, stay with us. This is your space too. Subscribe not for content, but for connection, for reminders of what matters, for a slow unfolding of the self that doesn't ask for perfection, just presence. Let's keep thinking, clearly, courageously, compassionately, because the world needs minds that are awake, and souls that are unafraid to feel, and people like you who choose awareness, even when ignorance would be easier. Join us. We're not here to escape the world. We're here to understand it, and more importantly, to understand ourselves within it.